Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the old masturbator, and this is the old masturbator's dog, and she's wanting to get up. I've been setting up for this for 10 minutes, and she wanted to get up the whole time, and as soon as I started, she wants to get down. I have the worst trained dog in the world, but we still love you. We love you, but you're a very difficult dog. You want to get up now? Okay. All right, just for a minute. Okay, so if we had production values here, we would cut right through this, but I don't know how to edit really, so I edit it in the can. I'm like not in the toilet, but in the can, like Roger Corman. He was famous for that. We edit everything in the can here, and we do it half-assed, or we don't do it at all. And we're doing especially half-assed if that's possible today. Lucky and Doda's here, and I'm here, and I have a kind of stack of books to talk about here. And I sometimes think the people who do like to watch the show, and I guess they're out there. There's Doda there. Here she comes. The people who watch the show just really look at it to look at books. I think it's like they're not browsing it. Oh, okay, you're gonna lie down. They don't browse at bookshops as much anymore, so they just kind of look at my books. I think that's fine. That's basically all you need to do. Today, our kind of ostensible reason for talking today is about Donald Barthelme, the new collected stories from Library of America Press, which is kind of a cool looking book. It's all his short stories, none of his novels, but all of his short stories, which come in, they weigh in about 1,000 pages. It's a pretty solid book with fairly small print, as I've talked about in the past. It's pretty densely put together, and it's all of his short story collections. And I wrote a piece about Barthelme, which I'll link to the bottom here, at the end. And I don't want to talk too much about Barthelme. You can read the piece if you're interested in my thoughts of him. I used to really like him. I take that back. When he came out, he was very, very trendy in the New Yorker. And I remember when I was 17, 18, reading writers I loved. I remember reading his stuff and kind of going, it was not much there. It just seemed kind of a little airy to me. And so I was never quite into him when I was young, and when he was at kind of the height of his glory was in the 60s and early 70s. And I liked a couple of his stories, but they're just a little too whimsical for me. He also wrote some novels, which I thought were too long. And then somewhere in the 70s and early 80s, I tried him again, and I really started to enjoy a lot of things about Barthelme, particularly the way he kind of sits down fresh to every sentence. As a writer, it's kind of nice to read somebody who just isn't worried about plot and storyline, and who does tell a story along the way, but who really sits down. Every sentence has to be kind of fun, have a little fizz to it, a little pop. And I like the way he wrote his sentences. And so that was basically it. I used to read him sometimes, just to enjoy, freshen up your head, to see how much fun you could have with just a simple sentence. So that was my whole history with Barthelme, and then I had a chance to write about him and go back and reread him. I like to do pieces on these Library of Americas because it gives me a chance to do the two things I like about a writer, kind of go back and kind of read through most of their work, and then read a biography with it. There's a wonderful Tracy Dougherty biography of Barthelme that I read while I was doing this, and it was as enjoyable, if not more enjoyable, than reading the Barthelme stories. I really enjoyed reading about him, and I guess Dougherty was a student of Barthelme's and a friend, and he gave a really warm portrait of this guy. And that I kind of tell you a little bit about that in the essay. So anyway, I was going to read a little passage from this in a bit, give you an idea of him. But I can see some people don't quite like Barthelme. I think they feel about him the way I did when I first started reading him. And I used to use him in classes just to say to people, look, what he does is he starts off his story, and in the first few sentences he sets up a little frame for his story. And he knows where the frame allows him to go, and he doesn't know where he's going. And you can sort of watch each one of his stories start off as kind of just a little game that he plays with a reader, and then he follows through in that game, and he comes to a conclusion. And it's just as simple as that. I couldn't really analyze one of his stories and say it was about, America, or it was about the Sino-Soviet relations. It was just about that story. It was fun to read for itself. So anyway, I used to use him in class, and most of my students didn't like him. But I think you should try him. I think he's kind of fun. This is our big Manhattan, because I'm going to do a couple of these today. I might share it with Lucky and Dodo, as Lucy's not home, so we can have a little bit of party for an hour or two. So what I started thinking about while I was looking at this kind of lovely book is one of the things I do. As you've seen, I've kind of emptied out the shelves. I have a whole bunch of Library of America books that I've bought since they really started coming out, and sometimes I keep them, and sometimes I don't. And it's kind of it. There's arguments for these volumes and arguments against them. And the argument for having the collected stories is probably the best argument I can think of, which is it makes shelf space. It does two things that I really want in this type of a book. It puts all the books into one thing. So I have like, here's 4 of the books that are in this book, but there's about 5 or 6 others are in my shelves. I'm selling. I'm putting I put them up in the closet, and so it's a big stack of books that kind of boils down to this. I don't care if they're textually accurate or not. They're always saying it's textually. Some textual expert has gone through and made sure every colon is in the right place, and no one put a semicolon where they should have put a comma and stuff like that. There's none of that in this. I wouldn't notice it if they had the textually correct editions of his stories or not. But they do have that. They have nice little chronology of his life in it. And they're handsome books, and they're kind of cool little books. And so while they come in at a pretty heavy cost, these are like $45, $50 each one of these volumes, it kind of is a nice way to make space. Now, on the other hand, it's a bit of a debate in my head, because in some ways, those are the perfect ways to read Barthelme. This makes sense. He really should be read in small doses. Like Sadness is one of his better collections. Look, it's a beautiful old Bantam paperback. Isn't that beautiful? The typography is really clear and large. The stories are very light and whimsical, and it kind of needs the nice big breaks, the nice big page breaks in between the stories. And in something like City Life, which is another one of his best stories, when he does all his big, he does a lot of visual stuff in it. At the Tolstoy Museum, there's a big picture of Tolstoy. And he would break up his story along the way and kind of collage in all these pictures and photographs and stuff like that. And in some ways, that's the perfect way to read that volume, because it has its own little story to it, this whole little shape to it. And as I've talked in the past, I love single author collections more than the collected stories. However, go back to defending this book. This book is put together so that all of the individual volumes, for example, Overnight to Many Different Cities, has been placed in its own section. So you're still getting the integrity of that original book, and you know what the beginning and the end, what story he put at the beginning and what he put at the end is there. And that makes this book quite handy to have. I much prefer this to collected stories where they just put everything in, everything the writer put in. And then what it does is it takes uncollected stories and extra stories that he added to some of those big things he did near the end of his life, like 40 stories and 50 stories and so forth. And it abstracts those out and shows that these are the stories that are added in. So it's kind of a great volume to have. As much as I love these books, I'm afraid I'm going to have to get rid of them. And even some of these where you get these big uncollected stories, that's all in here too. So that's my argument for getting rid of these and getting rid of those. At the same time, I was looking through all my various Library of America volumes. Cheers. And someone sneaks up on me and jumps on my head. I was looking at some of these other books I had. So a lot of these books I picked up, like Richard Wright's later works. Richard Wright is one of my favorite writers of that. Particularly, I love naturalistic writing, and I love his work. And I love Native Son. It's one of my favorite American novels. Now, there's a side of me that wants to get all the 2 or 3 volumes of Richard Wright, but I would prefer, I think the novel has its own integrity, or his collection of stories, Uncle Tom's Children, has its own little integrity to it, and they look nice by themselves, and they read well, like small books, like not small books, but as individual volumes. So having these are difficult. I never got the early volumes of Richard Wright. Is this absolutely no interest to anybody? But it's just looking at books is basically it. I did get this one, the late one. Now, The Outsider has a nice individual perennial library paperback, which I would prefer. But it has the original American Hunger with all the stuff that was cut out. So I've kept this rather than get those. And there's a side of me that wants to get rid of these and get the original paperbacks, because that to me is what a great writer should be read. At the same time, I haven't read this yet. I think I showed it in New Bapalula once. A Library of America also included this unpublished book of his, The Man Who Lived Underground. And every time I read a biography, I've read a couple biographies of Wright. This sounds like the book. No one wanted to publish it in his lifetime. It sounds like the book he was sort of wanted. He was born to write, or he at the end of his life he really wanted to write. And I kind of want to read that. So other volumes. For example, this is kind of a cool Nathaniel West volume to have, because you can usually get the 4 volumes. He wrote 4 short novels. 2 of them are wonderful, and the other 2 I can't never quite remember. But this also has some of his movie scripts, and a lot of his movie scripts, and a number of other things, and like fragments of different stuff. And so here's a kind of great book. So I ended up getting rid of my individual volumes of the novels because this has so much extra material in it that you kind of I wanted to have, just because I do love Nathaniel West. Jack London's one of my favorites. I do want to do Jack London on here one of these days. All of his books really should be read in these like beautiful paperback editions. Especially the Penguin orange spined editions. Those are beautiful books. That's a great collection of stories. Call of the Wild, White Fang, and other stories. But then they had 2 volumes of London, and I got them. I probably will never get. I ended up getting rid of a lot of my paperbacks, like the Sea Wolf and White Fang and so forth. And because here's one with 3 of his most famous novels, and then lots of stories. His short stories are really incredible, I always thought, and especially when I read him when I was really young, and I read him not too many years ago, and I still love him. And this has not only this has all the kind of Martin Eden, which is one of my all-time favorite novels. His kind of autobiographical novel about growing up in Oakland and learning to write. And then it has some books I haven't read. John Barleycorn about his alcoholism, and a couple of his The Road. The Road, they based that movie, The Emperor of the North, was based on. It was about his hoboing days. And People of the Abyss and The Iron Healer is kind of socialist novels about the future of tyranny and so forth. They're very kind of like they're like beginnings of Orwell. You see Orwell in him. It's great to have the O'Connor. Again, I would rather have a little paperback sometimes, but I don't have the room in my space. And this has not only her stories and her few novels, but then all these uncollected things, all these uncollected stories, and then letters and some of her essays. So what can you do? I'll probably keep those. Here's another one. Things like Hart Crane, these individual poets who have interest, who I don't know if I'll ever read them as complete, but that's a great volume, isn't it? You really want that. I have ones on Stevens. Wow, that's one volume, but then you have 2 volumes of W.S. Merwin, and he is a major poet. He's a poet I do like to just dip into, and I've got both of those volumes, and I got rid of all my individual volumes. Same with Ashbery. I'm not as big into Ashbery, but John Ashbery has 2 volumes from them. Everything is in there. You never have to pick up another John Ashbery book. So Robert Frost. The Robert Frost volume is great. And one last one I just got the other day, because I never know what Ambrose Bierce to have. I haven't read a lot of Ambrose Bierce, but he's on my list of stuff I always wanted to read more closely. What I've read, I've really liked. Here's a volume which has has all his stories, and it even has the Devil's Dictionary, which is hilarious. And I looked at the back. It's edited by S.T. Joshi. He's one of one of our friends, our favorite people here at the Bathtub. He's like the most ubiquitous writer I could think of. Every time I turn around, I think he's gonna come out of the closet sometimes. He's edited so many books and put them out all the time. Anyway, he edited this lovely volume. And if you wanted to know Bierce, there's tons of editions of Bierce, but this might be the one to do. That's the one I'm going to keep. I'm not really going to bother with the others. Okay, so that's it. I'm not going to talk any more. I went on much too long. See, I don't even know where to put books anymore, which is why I got to get rid of them all. I'm just going to read a paragraph from Barthelme, a little paragraph from a story I like. It's actually one of these little kind of interstitial stories, these little bits. He wrote these little fragments to go in between other stories in one of his later collections. It may have been 60 stories or 40 stories, I think. And it's not even a title. But the first paragraph is, you see a guy set up a story. He doesn't know what he's doing. He sets it up nice and clear, give himself a few map directions, and then he just follows it. This is the opening of the story. The first thing the baby did wrong was to tear pages out of her books. So we made a rule that each time she tore a page out of a book, she had to stay alone in a room for 4 hours, behind the closed doors. She was tearing out about a page a day in the beginning, and the rule worked fairly well, although the crying and screaming from behind the closed door were unnerving. We reasoned that that was the price you had to pay, or part of the price you had to pay. But then, as her grip improved, she got to tearing out 2 pages at a time, which meant 8 hours alone in her room, behind the closed door, which just doubled the annoyance for everybody. But she wouldn't quit doing it, and then as time went on, we began getting days when she tore out 3 or 4 pages, which put her into the room for as much as 16 hours at a stretch, interfering with normal feeding and worrying my wife. But I felt that if you made a rule, you had to stick to it. Had to be consistent, otherwise they get the wrong idea. She was about 14 months old or 15 months old at that point. Often, of course, she'd go to sleep after an hour or so of yelling. That was a mercy. Her room was very nice, with a nice wooden rocking horse, and practically 100 dolls and stuffed animals. Lots of things to do in that room if you use your time wisely, puzzles and things. Unfortunately, sometimes, when we opened the door, we'd find that she'd torn more pages out of more books while she was inside, and these pages had to be added to the total, in fairness. So the regimen of punishing the baby becomes a regimen of punishing yourself. You're so tied up in it. It's a very funny little story. Okay, I'm gonna let this go. It's too long, but again, I do love these volumes for many reasons. For many reasons, sometimes I would rather have the individual books, but that's my argument for some of the better volumes in this series. There's so many good things. You know, if you like Philip Roth, I think you just get the Philip Roth novels probably. But there's a very good reason to get Bierce, because there's not many good editions of Bierce, and there's not good collections of stories. And this is everything he wrote, and it's in one little volume, or most of his stories and important stuff, including a lot of memoirs I don't know anything about, which are hard to find anywhere. So then it's nice to get that. Okay, happy bathing. We'll see you very soon.